Okay, so without further ado, I shall introduce tonight's speaker, Elaine Jamieson, who joins us from the University of York, where she's the head of archaeological fieldwork. Elaine had a long career at what was English Heritage as a landscape archaeologist or archaeological investigator, and has since joined the University of York, where she's going to be talking to us this evening about recent archaeological investigations at Skipsea Castle and its landscape. Take it away, Elaine. Oh, I think I've muted you, Elaine. I'll still unmute.
There we go. That was a new thing for me, that you'd muted me and I couldn't find out how to unmute.
Don't want to listen to you.
So I can just check everyone can see my slides then, can they?
I can.
Yeah, excellent, good. Okay, I just wanted to start by thanking the Castle Studies Group for inviting me to do this talk this evening. What I'm going to talk to you about, as you can see from the first slide, is work that we've been carrying out at Skipsea Castle in Holderness in East Yorkshire. And this is research that I've been undertaking on and off, now that I come to think of it, for about 9 years. I've been drawn back to the site again and again. And I was first taken there in 2015 when I was working on a research project called the Round Mounds Project. And I just found it such an interesting, captivating site that we've gone back and done various other projects. And now I'm working there, running our archaeological field school at the University of York. So it's had quite a big influence on my life, Skipsea Castle. I want to just discuss this evening just the results of these various small research projects that we've been doing, and then the sort of larger excavation, which is still ongoing. And we're just completed our second season of work there. And hopefully what I'm going to do is start by putting the research in a bit of context and explain to you what's so interesting about Skipsea Castle. Oh, there we go, it has moved on. So for those of you who don't know, Skipsea Castle is located about 12 kilometres to the south of Bridlington. And it's within the sort of gently undulating landscape of Holderness. And Holderness itself is bounded to the west by the sort of gentle valley of the River Hull, and to the south by the Humber. And then on the east coast, we've got the North Sea coastline. And then to the north, we've got the sort of sweep of the Yorkshire. Holderness itself is quite a low-lying area, and it's formed primarily of sort of glacial deposits of clay, overlying chalk, with the chalk outcropping on the Yorkshire wolds. This very soft nature of the coastline along the North Sea means it's very susceptible to erosion. And indeed, that coastline is eroding about 2 metres every year, as they estimate. So we've lost quite a lot of medieval settlements, medieval ports along that coastline already. And it's forever creeping closer to Skipsea Castle. There was about 70 lakes across this region, and the only one that's left now is at Hornsey. So the area was quite comprehensively drained, starting from about the 13th century onwards. And most of the lakes were kind of drained into the River Hull. And this has quite significantly changed the character of the landscape that we see today. And I think I'll talk a little bit about that as I go on. Now, I just wanted to give you a little bit of historical background to Skipsea Castle. Skipsea itself as a place was not recorded in the Domesday Book, and the head of the manor was a place called Cleaton, which is now lost, seemingly lost settlement of Cleaton. And the sort of manor of Cleaton was actually quite a large and valuable manor at Domesday. And it was one of only 3 manors that was actually held by Harold Godwinson north of the Humber. There's another manor at Bridlington, but that formed part of the Skipsea Manor, and another one at Catton to the east, which is just next to Stamford Bridge, which is an important crossing, as I'm sure all of you know, on the River Derwent. At the time of the conquest, as you can see from this image here, Holderness itself was divided into sort of 300s, so North Hundred, Middle Hundred, and South Hundred. And just the naming of those hundreds suggests that we might actually have been looking at a single area of lordship prior to that. And even the fact that it's hundreds and not wapentakes is quite unusual for Yorkshire. And indeed, they were all grouped together into a single wapentake by the 12th century, or possibly earlier than that. Now, Skipsea itself, the castle at Skipsea, it functioned as the centre of the honour of Holderness, and this was one of these compact lordships granted following the conquest. It was actually granted to a chap called Drogo de la Bouvier, who fought with William the Conqueror at the Battle of Hastings. Drogo was actually married to William the Conqueror's niece, who likes to keep these things in the family. But unfortunately, Drogo seems to have murdered William's niece, and he fled back to France before he could face the wrath of the king. So the castle and the holding of Holderness, the lordship, was given to Odo Champagne, who himself was married to William's sister. And it's thought that Odo Champagne was the first of the counts of O'Mail. And they, of course, perhaps maybe best known for building the castle at Scarborough. Now, by the time that we get into the beginning of the early 12th century, it had passed to William of O'Mail, or William the Grass. And he's, again, best known really for fighting at the Battle of the Standards in 1138. And he really distinguished himself in that battle. And as a result of that, he was made Earl of York. And that was his reward for how well he had fought at the battle. And he quickly began to establish himself as one of the most powerful barons in Yorkshire. And although he was initially a supporter of Stephen at the time of the anarchy, his allegiances seemed to change to more like self-interest. And he started, as you can see from this image here, minting his own coins around about 1150, which gives us a sort of indication that he had aspirations to be even more powerful in the north. He was obviously one of several powerful northern barons who started minting their coins for this short periods of time. But what it does do is give us an image of William of Mail. You see him here in this coin with his sword and his fighting helmet, and just sort of portraying himself as this sort of leader. Now, if we look, hopefully that's given you just a quick little bit of background to how Skipsea Castle has started to evolve in this landscape. To look at the castle in a bit more detail, the main focal point of Skipsea Castle is this really large mound or motte known as Castle Hill, and Castle Hill rises to about 12 metres above the bottom of the surrounding relatively shallow ditch. Beyond that, to the south, there is a substantial enclosure or inner bailey, part of which has been ploughed down. Whether one of the other sides had a bank and has been ploughed away isn't really clear. It may have been that actually that side of the bailey was defined by water in the lake, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Beyond the inner bailey, we have a curving kind of clay ridge that you can see just in the top of that slide here, and that's called Skipsea Brough. And that's defined by a really substantial bank that stands about 3 metres high and a very substantial outer ditch. So we've got this motte and double bailey sort of arrangement although it's quite an unusual looking castle. The castle itself is very poorly documented. There's a reference to a castle chapel in 1102, and there's a suggestion that there's a borough settlement formed outside the southern gate of the castle in about 1160s. It was supposed to be there, though possibly constructed much earlier than that. And you can just see the sort of remnants of that sort of urban centre that they were trying to develop outside the castle in the sort of top left-hand side of the slide. And that's what's now the hamlet of Skipsea Brough. The castle is thought to have allegedly been destroyed by Henry III in sort of 1221. Though how much of the castle was actually destroyed at that time is obviously really unclear. And again, this was because there was a rebellion by William de Vos II, who was actually the grandson of William le Gras. And because of that, the castle was slighted. What we do know, however, is that by the 13th century, the Counts of Amal had relocated their sort of centre of lordship in Holderness down to another castle at Burswick, which is in southern Holderness. So we know that the castle at Skipsea was not the centre by about 1200, we think, so pretty early on. By the mid-14th century, at least, we've got documentary references to the castle being laid, at least in part, to pasture. And then by the end of the 14th century, it was just documented as being wasteland and had no value whatsoever. So it seemed to be that we've got a relatively short-lived lifespan for this castle. And so it may have been abandoned, as I say, as early as the early 13th century. So it gives us the potential that we've actually got a good preservation of 11th and 12th century castle here at Skipsea that's just been left and laid to pasture without any later changes and alterations to it. So really interesting from that point of view. The potential of it is really high. If we look just slightly beyond the castle, what you can see, hopefully just about make out in this slide here, to the east we have the Church of Old Saint. And there's no early fabric in this church. Pevsner thinks the earliest fabric dates from about 1300, but it seems very unlikely that it wasn't part of the sort of great rebuilding in the 12th century. But there isn't actually a lot of Romanesque churches in Holderness. It seems that they were quite comprehensively rebuilt in the 13th century. There is an interesting documentary reference to sort of Romanesque style motifs built into some of the buildings in the village itself. So these may have come from the church, but there's also the potential that these may have come from the castle itself. So beyond the church and just slightly detached from it, you've got the village of Holderness, which is what you can see in that slide. Village of Holderness, village of Skipsea, which is what you can see in that slide there. It's built around a sort of open green, and it looks like we probably had settlement on one side of the green, and it's been expanded on the other side into what was open fields. This slide is also good for showing you how close the North Sea is to us now, and you can smell the sea from the castle. As I said, there was a port actually at Skipsea recorded in the 13th century, a port called New Hythe. And the fact it's called New Hythe suggests there might have been an Old Hythe, and that we might have lost that. And then New Hythe was being lost to the sea and had been completely lost by the 14th century. So you're seeing that influence of all that coastal erosion having, all that influence it's having on the landscape. So as I mentioned, the parish of Skipsea has at its centre a complex of what are ancient lakes, Skipsea Balemere, Skipsea Lowmere, and Skipsea Withermere. And these lakes themselves have revealed evidence for human activity in this landscape, stretching over a very prolonged period of time. The motte itself sits right in the centre of Skipsea Mere, and it actually sits on a sand and gravel island, essentially, in the mere, which is it's why it sits in such a strange location that's actually been built on its island. So originally, when constructed, it almost certainly would have been, if not completely surrounded, at least partly surrounded by water. And this is where the suggestion that the inner bailey might have been defined on one side by the lakes.
Mm-hmm.
The name Skipsea itself actually means sort of lake navigable by ships. So it indicates the settlement and the castle were taking their name from the lake that was already there. And that's a Scandinavian name, so Old Norse name essentially. So suggesting that by the sort of later Anglo-Saxon period, if you want to call it that, then we still had water in the lake. And actually there is later medieval references to kind of fishing, the value of the fishing and fowling in the lakes here as well. So although Skipsea Castle itself didn't have any parkland, it had this fishing and fowling sort of parkland type landscape, if that makes sense.
Mm.
There's been quite a lot of work done looking at this, the kind of paleoenvironmental investigations of Holderness. And part of the wetlands, the Humber Wetlands project, they did some coring across the lake, indicating that we've got about 5 metres of peat in the bottom of this wetland, spanning the entire lake glacial period, right through to the mid-Holocene. So there's quite an exciting potential in this lake for good preservation of timber, trackways, earlier settlement evidence. Now, there's not a lot of research has been done on the castle itself. There's been some survey work that was done by the Humberside Archaeological Unit in the 1980s. They did a survey of the castle, but there's been no excavations that have been recorded of at the castle. There is an intriguing reference to a line of piles that were noted that were supposed to be part of a bridge or a causeway, and that was noted in 1911, although very unfortunately they didn't say where they were in the landscape, they just noted they'd been seen. So we don't know exactly what they were looking at, but it seems likely that they possibly crossed the Skipsea drain, so one of the main drains used to drain the lake. And that's quite often when they're sort of dredging these drains that these things come up. So we're presuming it might be that's there that they saw it. But again, one of these sort of intriguing references that we're keen to try and track down where this was. Now, the sort of cleaning out of the drains has been something that's actually brought up quite a lot of archaeological work. And what you can see here is a photograph of a very fine chap called Thomas Boynton, who was a local farmer and landowner. And he was actually the commissioner of the drains in the 1880s. And he realised while he was cleaning out the drains or having them dredged that there was actually evidence for possible archaeological activity coming up as part of this. And he did two excavations, one about 800 metres to the north of the castle and one just slightly further north than that. So in Skipsea Balemere and Skipsea Lowmere, where he found stakes and what he called piles that had been driven into the peatland. And in amongst all of that, he found lots of prehistoric evidence of prehistoric activity. So stone tools, bone and antler tools, some pottery, including this very fine reconstructed bit of pot from the British Museum, indicating that there was definitely settlement activity along the edge of the lakes in the Neolithic and in the Bronze Age. And at this time, they thought what we're looking at was these kind of lake dwellings, which were quite a popular concept from the continent at that time. And obviously, we've got the sort of glassbury lake dwellings being excavated around this sort of time as well. So that was what was thought that these might be. Though later people have suggested that they might actually be trackways, so timber trackways crossing the lake. But anyway, we've got this evidence for prehistoric activity in the region. Now, what I want to go on to talk about is just the more recent archaeological work that we've been doing at the castle site. And as I said at the start, I was first taken to the castle site doing reconnaissance work for the Extending Histories from Medieval Moats to Prehistoric Round Mounds project. And this was a project funded by the Leverhulme Trust, undertaken by staff from the University of Reading. And it was really asking a very simple question: are some medieval moats older than we think? And it really came out of a piece of work that my colleague Jim Leary did, looking at the Marlborough Mound in Wiltshire. And he cored the mound, which obviously is a castle moat of Marlborough Castle. He cored the mound and recovered material from it that was radiocarbon dated. And what that showed is that it was a reused Neolithic mound of a comparable date to Silbury Hill. Jim just happened to be doing work at Silbury Hill at the time, and he was driving past the Marlborough Mound every day on his way to work. And that just sort of sparked the interest in him, whether or not this could possibly be something earlier. So it was really work that stemmed from that. And we then selected 20 castle moats around the country that we thought had prehistoric potential. We undertook a programme of new survey work of the mound, of coring work, coring from the top of the mound right down to the base. And we recovered material in sort of metre-long plastic tubing, like you would use in plumbing. So there's metre-long sheets of that, and we basically remove all these cores, look for material in them suitable for radiocarbon dating, and radiocarbon dated these mounds. So that took us to Skipsea, and we did this work at Skipsea Castle. And as I said, it was chosen simply because of its form, its location, and its association with these known prehistoric sites. It's sat in a very watery landscape, which is quite indicative of prehistoric mounds, surrounded by sort of hills, so sort of overlooked. So there was these key sort of indicators we thought there might be something earlier there. So you can see that when we were there, we had typical Yorkshire weather. It was absolutely teeming it down. We had sea har, and then we had rain for most of the time. So it was a pretty miserable experience for those 2 days that we were there. But we sent the material off that we recovered during that work, and we got 6 radiocarbon dates from the buried soil that was beneath the mound, so a very compressed layer of buried soil. And these returned late Bronze Age and early Iron Age dates. We also retrieved some material from the very lower layers of the mound, and that gave us a Middle Iron Age date, suggesting to us there's a sort of terminus postquem, so a date after which the mound could have been built, really, of 404 to 239 BC. And that was surprised us. That wasn't something that we were expecting to find. Now, with the nature of the methodology that we used for this project, we cannot say for certain when that castle mound was built. All we can say, it's very unusual that the other mounds that we looked at, the majority of them, we only recovered medieval dates from the mounds. So the project proved that most castle moats, or the ones that we looked at, are medieval date and were constructed then. But there is still this possibility that we have got some that were reused. And I think they're going to be very difficult things to find. Looking for a mound in a mound is quite a difficult thing to find. But it raises the possibility that we've got something earlier here. And Yorkshire itself, I mean, if this date came from somewhere else, we might dismiss it, but Yorkshire itself has a very interesting and different sort of mound building tradition in the Iron Age. And we have what are square barrow mounds being built, so sort of round mounds surrounded by square ditches in the Iron Age that you do get in other parts of the East Coast, but they're very focused on Yorkshire. So it's very kind of continental looking. So you have to look towards the continent, to Germany and France, to see this Iron Age mound building tradition. What is evident though is that the mound at Skipsea, because it's 13 metres high, is much larger than anything else that we've got on mainland Britain. You've got mounds that size on the continent, but not in Britain. So it is possible, given the tradition of mound building in Yorkshire, that it's an earlier mound. But there's also the possibility that what we're seeing is evidence of Iron Age activity happening on that island before the mound was built. So there is that possibility. So I think it's going to take further work before we can say definitively that we're looking at an Iron Age mound. But it's still intriguing, and one of the reasons that it piqued our interest in Skipsea Castle. After that date, after we got that date, we went back to do a little bit of further work focused on Skipsea Brough, because the suggestion had been put to us that the large enclosure of Skipsea Brough itself might be something earlier. So we got some money from the Yorkshire Archaeological and Historical Society and some money from a research fund at the University of Reading to do a small pilot project, the Skipsea Castle Archaeological Research Pilot Project. And we undertook some geophysical survey across Skipsea Brough. We undertook a detailed survey actually of the entire castle site. We resurveyed the entire castle and the settlements to the north and to the south. So we comprehensively did an earthwork survey of the whole area. And we also did some evaluation excavation at the site. Now, the geophysical survey, it was interesting in itself in that it showed that there was a real focus of activity towards the southern entrance into Skipsea Brough, and very little apparent in this in magnetometry anyway from the rest of the enclosure. So a suggestion had been put forward that this enclosure was actually part of the borough settlement, but there was very little evidence at all from the geophysical survey or indeed from the earthwork survey that we had lots of settlement activity in this enclosure. As I said, we did a sort of analytical survey, earthwork survey across the entire site, also recording the settlement or part of the settlement of Dringhole, which is on the outside of the northern enclosure into Skipsea Brough. And we actually used LiDAR, but now have gone back and done survey work, picking up the earthwork remains at Skipsea Brough hamlet on the south side of the enclosure. So just to sort of talk about our sort of interpretation of that earthwork survey, what was really clear from the earthwork remains was that big outer enclosure bank to Skipsea Brough was actually constructed in two phases. So we see one sort of single phase along the north and largely down the western side, and then the bank itself, it drops down in height and then it kind of wiggles. And you see where a second bank has been constructed, essentially one leading towards the other, and they don't quite meet each other. They're not the same size and not quite on the same alignment, so they don't quite meet each other. So that indicates to me that we've got at least two phases of activity going on of construction of that bank. It may be that they were constructed relatively close in time to each other, but there's certainly two different events going on there. We also could see quite clearly the enclosure bank for the inner bailey, and much of it has been ploughed down. And again, we've suggested from small bits of evidence, we have small sort of stubs of bank coming off the castle moat that indicate where the other side of an enclosure bank may have run. but that sort of helps us define that castle bailey, the inner bailey. And the castle mound itself, I've put up sort of a couple of images here just so you can see a bit more detail. On one side of the mound, so on the sort of southeastern side of the mound, we have a big kind of gash up the mound. And about halfway up that gash, we've got a bit of walling, and it's the only bit of stone walling that survives on the site at all. And it suggests that we've possibly got a sort of stairway arrangement or a tower, an access way up from that side up onto the top of the castle mound. And we've also got the very distinct break and slope going around the mound, which indicates that we've probably got a stone wall actually encircling the top of the mound. So we have got some strong indicators that we've got a stone-built castle. So we're not looking at a castle that was just built in timber, but this castle was rebuilt in stone. And this area doesn't have good building stone. So what we're seeing is lots of these sort of water-worn boulders used to build any of the stone structures in that area. And lots of the farm buildings and the church fabric of the church is built from these water-worn boulders. And it seems possible that actually a lot of them might have come from the castle. So a lot of the older buildings in the village actually might have been built with material salvaged from the castle. On the east side of the castle mound, there's also an extensive area of quarrying, and basically they've quarried away sand and gravel from that island, and possibly building stone as well. And there is a documentary reference to that quarrying, and it's actually used to build the road causeway that you now drive across to get across what had been Skipsea Bay near to the village. So they were quarrying material locally to use it as sort of hardcore for the road. So what really came out of this was this idea that the enclosure of the outer bailey was built in two phases, and what we've got fossilised inside it is actually part of an earlier settlement. So I've drawn it out here. So the Skipsea Brufford settlement seems to have extended further to the north, and that's what's surviving fossilised within the outer bailey of the castle. And it may be that that is the reason why we have two phases of building of this outer enclosure, because they stopped when they came to the settlement and then decided, no, we're just going to build it across. We also have some very irregular plots on the west side, suggesting that we've got these burgage plots of this sort of urban type settlement that they were trying to construct here. So we've got evidence of these two different forms of settlement on each side of what would have been a marketplace. And indeed, the other interesting thing is that the entrance into the castle on this side is really wide entrance that seems to conform to the width of the marketplace, which was then later narrowed, and they later created a second bank to narrow this entrance. So all of this suggests that we've got sort of multiple phases of building and enlargement going on in the castle. And actually this large outer bailey might have been quite a late addition to the castle. So the question really is, why were they then building this? And our strong feeling on this was that the castle itself might originally have faced and been accessed from the other side, possibly from the east, because we have the settlement of Skipsea, we've got the church on that side. And if you approach the castle moat is really evident when you drive down the northern road towards Skipsea. You can see the castle really clearly. But if you come from the west, so when you come from the side, approach from York, essentially, then you can't see the castle moat at all. It's hidden by that clay ridge. So the suggestion that we put forward is that possibly they were constructing this large outer enclosure to make the castle much more impressive when it was approached from that side. It also suggests that the focus is possibly changing from the seaward side to the landward side, and this might relate to William the Grass having York Castle, he also held the castle at Driffield, which is on the east side as well. So that actually the focus might be focusing towards York and access from that side rather than from the north and from the seaward side. So as I said, we undertook some small evaluation excavations across the castle, the outer enclosure, outer bailey bank, really. And the main reason for this was to try and get some dating evidence. As I said, the suggestion had been put forward that it might be prehistoric, and the earthwork evidence suggested possibly not. But we wanted to put a trench across just so we could confirm this. We also put some evaluation trenches in the interior, just focused on some of the geophysical survey anomalies, but unfortunately they didn't actually reveal anything at all. Now we got some CEO grains from the soil layer immediately beneath the bank, and they gave us a term as postcrem for the construction of the bank of 1042 to 1222. So very firmly putting it in the medieval period. From our work looking at all the castle mounds, you realise very quickly that there is a plateau in the radiocarbon curve, and this time, and almost all of our dates spanned the kind of 1040s to around about 1200s, that kind of span. So with radiocarbon dating, you've got this real problem that it's very difficult to have that sort of pre or post-conquest date. You just don't get that. But what it does tell us is that we are not looking at an Iron Age enclosure. We are certainly looking at a medieval enclosure. I've just put up some pottery. We found that there was some late medieval pottery in the fill of the ditch as well. So it looks like they were starting to fill up the ditch by the time we're getting into the kind of 13th, 14th century. Just to come on really to the sort of last phase of field that we're still undertaking at the moment. And this is what we're calling the Skipsea Landscape project. And this is a 6-year fieldwork project. And we're not simply looking at the castle, we're looking at the whole of the landscape. It's a multi-period research project. So we're trying to look at the evolution of this landscape from prehistory right through to the medieval period. What I'm going to concentrate on just this last part of my talk is work that we've been undertaking at Sparrowcroft. This isn't the only area we've been looking at, but this is an area that's relevant, I think, for the castle. One of the reasons that we focused in this area was this idea that the castle originally faced towards the east. And you can see from this early 1850s, early OS map, that they actually recorded a sort of linear earthwork enclosure on that side. And that enclosure is completely gone now, it's been ploughed out. But you can see this sort of rise in the ground. And while we were doing the survey of the castle itself, we kept looking across towards it, going, that looks like an interesting ridge over there. And you can see on this really nice aerial photograph from 2018.
Stop. Sorry, Elaine. Someone's sharing their screen, which is Katrin and Alan Eiberg. We're viewing your screen. If you could stop sharing, please. Or maybe, Elaine, if you reshare yours.
If Elaine reshares, that should take over.
Okay.
Okay, let me just go in this way. Okay, can you see my screen now?
Yeah, thank you.
That's back. Good, good. Right. Yeah, so I was just talking about this enclosure of Sparrowcroft. so the idea of the thoughts that we had was actually possibly what we were looking at is one of either an early bailey that had essentially been lost to the castle, or something that predated the castle. I think with the location of it, it adjoins the settlement north of the church. So we're looking at an area that's kind of reminiscent of a kind of manorial centre, possibly. So it had all these sort of feelings that we're looking at something that might be sort of early. Oh, I can't change slides. Oh, there we go. So the first thing that we did was go up to that area and do some geophysical survey. We did some geophysical survey focused on that ridge, and also just trying to take in the area immediately round about it. And what that immediately showed is it was quite busy. There's quite a lot going on up there. One of the main things that jumped out to us was this sort of possible post-built structure. So we're seeing a sort of parallel lines of possible post holes or parallel pits, one of the two. There's also a series of gullies and other pits that we can see up there. You can just about make out the enclosure ditch on the geophysical survey, but it isn't obviously not full of very magnetic material, or not something that's significantly different to everything round about that it shows up clearly. But you can just about see it. And then also a possible second outer enclosure on the west side. So quite a lot to go at up there. We were quite excited when this came back. What I've marked on here is the two trenches that we put in 2023. So one essentially targeted on that what we thought might be a big post-built structure, and the other one crossing the outer enclosure ditch with the aim of trying to get material to date the construction of that outer enclosure. So if I start with the outer enclosure ditch, we did actually find the enclosure ditch, which is always very satisfying when you're excavating. We had to go down quite a lot further than we expected, and I'll talk a bit more about why that was the case. The ditch itself was relatively modest in size. It was only about 1.5 meters in width at its base, and relatively shallow in depth. But it did display evidence for truncation, and I think that's what we're getting across the whole site, really. So we're seeing that area really being levelled, quite comprehensively levelled, when it was turned over to arable cultivation. So that's been in the 20th century. So we were speaking to the farmer's father, who was the first to plough that field, and he said actually how large the enclosure ditches and banks or the scarps of the enclosure were at that time. So they made quite comprehensive effort to get rid of it. So actually, in some ways, we felt it was almost like a rescue excavation, what we were doing now, because obviously it's continuing to be ploughed. The enclosure ditch was filled with a series of deposits. I think I've got another slide with these in it. There we go. And within these deposits, we got various layers of deposits. We got medieval pottery. And most of the pottery that was looked at is mid or late 11th century to early 14th century in date. It's quite a broad range for this sort of Saxtonware pottery. So that indicates that the ditch itself was being filled up at that time. So we've got a ditch that was built. It could have been built slightly earlier, could have been cut slightly earlier, but sort of 10th, 11th century, not any earlier than that, we don't think. And interestingly, the pottery material we're getting out of it were big, fresh sherds that you can see. And also it is the date that the castle was occupied. So we are getting evidence of occupation on the Sparrowcroft Ridge at the same time as the castle was being occupied. So it kind of reinforces the suggestion there may have been something going on there at that time, at the same time as the castle. So the other thing that we looked at was this post-built structure. And if any of you who have excavated on sands and gravels, you might know just how difficult it is to just see features on the sands and gravels. Quite unusual for an excavation, but we were really praying for rain most of the time, because the ground dries up so quickly that when you clean back and uncover something, if it's a sunny day, within about an hour and a half, it's all covered in dust again. It all dries out really quickly. So it was a case of trying to clean back and using a drone to take aerial photographs constantly. So we were taking photographs at the end of each day or even partway through the day, just so we could start trying to see the features that we had in the trench. So we were all very relieved after our kind of big clean back that we could actually see these pits or post holes coming up. Our wonderful students started digging these post holes, and they just started to get larger and deeper the longer that we spent doing it. So we're looking at post holes that most of them are around about 1 metre in diameter, and the deepest are up to 80 centimetres deep. So they're really quite deep features. Some of them were clearly double post holes, so they've been cut and recut. And the others that looked like single post holes, they had evidence of different recutting at their base, suggesting that we're looking at a structure that had been rebuilt or repaired on the same footprint over a prolonged period of time. So when we excavated it, what we've got really is a large timber structure, about 16.2, 16.5 metres long, and between 5.5, 6 metres wide. So really substantial timber structure. Just to put it in context so you can see here. So really quite a big building. You can see this photograph of all our students, but you can see how the building itself aligns on the mound. It also sits quite centrally within the enclosure, and that sort of suggests to me that it could see that it was contemporary with the enclosure, or the enclosure was there at that time, or it's really just sitting centrally within the ridge. That's quite difficult to know. But it also, the way it lines up with the mound also suggests that it could see the mound as well. So we're still thinking that we're looking at something that's either just immediately pre-conquest or post-conquest. And obviously that depends on whether the mound itself is Iron Age or Norman. There's different variables that come into this. It's unusual in its form in that we were wholeheartedly expecting that we would have an aisled hall from this period, but we have not been able to find aisles essentially for it. And I think what we're coming round to realising is that there's been so much scouring across the top of this ridge, essentially moving earth to level out this ridge for agriculture, that actually I think possibly we've taken away the layers, and it may have been that the aisles were much shallower in depth, and it's only the post holes that are left. We've certainly got no flooring, no hearths, we've got nothing like that inside the building. So it looks like all of those layers have been taken away. So at the moment, that's our best guess, that we are looking at a building of that kind of period. And a lot of that's based on the form of it. You can see also in that plan, we've got that kind of bright kind of yellowy green at the top of it. And you can see that the post holes for the structure punch through, which what is an earlier floor of an earlier structure as well. And this was quite unexpected for us to find. And what we've got is a kind of puddled clay floor, different layers of puddled clay floor that, as they are punched through by the post-built structure. And on top of that floor, we've got a layer of daub. So we've got essentially what is the sort of wattle and daub panels that have fallen down onto this clay floor of a much earlier structure. And we've got some lovely, great big fresh bits of daub that have got lots of wattle and lots of stave marks in them. And the more we looked at this, we realised actually that there seems to be a panel that has fallen down flat, and then we can actually see the wiggling ridges of where the staves that held up the panels were. As is always the way, we only exposed part of this in our trench in 2023. So what we did was go back and open up a much larger area over this building to try and see if we could work out exactly what it was we had. We also did quite a lot of environmental work. So we recovered samples from all of our post holes, and we looked to see what was coming out of those samples. We had lots of cereal grains that came out, so predominantly hulled barley and free threshing wheat, but we also had oat and rye as secondary crops. And our archaeobotanist pointed out to us that this really corroborates the idea that we're looking at a medieval structure. So first of all, we panicked slightly and thought we might have found a Roman building, but actually we are convinced it's a medieval structure. And the other unusual thing about it was there's lots of cereal grain and wheat, but we had no chaff. And that suggests that we're not looking at like a barn type structure where they were storing grain. We're actually looking at something that's more domestic in nature. We also found the remains of cereal-based products, so food products. So the remains of bread and porridge, and that's being looked at. That's going to be analysed in a bit more detail. So very much this sort of signature of a domestic type structure. Now, in that first year, we just submitted 2 samples for radiocarbon dating, but we submitted them from the same post hole, which was the post hole at the western end of the structure that I've circled here. Barley grains returned a Roman date, which we panicked a little bit when we saw that. But we also put in a piece of hazel roundwood for radiocarbon dating, which we think is a bit of wattle, and it returned an early medieval date, so a 5th or 6th century date. And we think that's possibly material, or more likely material, that's come from this earlier wattle and daub structure that the post holes have actually punched through, suggesting that we've got something really early that possibly, or almost certainly, had been covered over, which is why it survives before the later building was built above it. So it gives us a bit of sort of chronology and the construction of these buildings. It also highlights the idea that cereal grains, although they are short-lived, are very easily intrusive materials. So I think you've got to be very careful that there's not lots of very intrusive material when you're dating things. Because obviously if we'd got these 2 dates from 2 different post holes, we might be starting to think we've got 2 buildings, but actually we're just looking at residual material. So we sort of enthused by and quite excited about the results we got from our first year. We went back to Sparrowcroft in 2024, so we went back in May of this year, and again opened a much larger trench. We wanted to define the extent of the wattle and daub and post-built structure. So we weren't convinced we had the end of the building of the post-built structure. And again, we just wanted to check to make sure that we couldn't find anything that might be evidence for an aisled structure. And we also wanted to try and explore some of these pits and gullies to try and find out exactly what was going on up in that ridge. Our trench across our enclosure ditch also identified a kind of wetland area on the east side of the sanding gravel ridge, and we'd found quite a large assemblage of prehistoric pottery in that. So we opened up a second trench this year to look at that area and see whether we had prehistoric activity going on up here as well. I'm going to start with that sort of wetland trench, because I know you're all medievalists and not really interested in this, so I'll get this over with. So we opened up a 2 metre wide trench and across an area that was a kind of peat area, so either a spring head or a small pond. So I think it gives you an indication of how wet this landscape is, and possibly why everything is focused on these sort of sand and gravel ridges to try and keep everybody's feet out of the water. But opening up just a very small area, we were really quite amazed that we found two what looked like prehistoric vessels that had been deposited in this wetland area. You can see them circled here. And then next to those, we also found what we perceive as a bag of bones. So we have a group of bones that are very tightly packed together, and we think must have been deposited in the wetlands in a bag. And that's the only reason that they've been kept together like that. And those are they're being looked at the moment, but they're mostly cattle and pig bones. And we're having those radiocarbon dated as well to see if we can get a date for that. We also, in that very small area that we opened up, we found in two very thin layers over 200 sherds of prehistoric pottery. So absolutely carpeted with prehistoric pottery, and we only excavated a very small amount of it. So it indicates that there is a lot of this prehistoric settlement going on up there somewhere. We haven't come across the buildings of the settlement, but we're seeing all the evidence for it. And interestingly, the kind of pottery we had from last year, we got dated, and we're looking at kind of late Iron Age pottery. So that's kind of contemporary with the dates that we got for the castle mound. So we also opened up the extent of this building, and obviously we're thinking that this building is 5th or 6th century in date, and I've kind of put an oval around the extent of it here. So it's a much smaller structure, about 10 and 12 meters long. We're not exactly sure how long it is, and we've got at least 2 large panels of wattle and daub that have fallen down onto this clay floor. And you can see really clearly the later post hole cutting through the floor. We put a sort of transect across it just to have a bit of a more detailed look at it. And we realised that we've got a kind of shallow wall plate, a trench for a wall plate on the outside. And it's also got post holes in it. So it's either a trench for post holes or it's a trench for a wall plate. So this is all still work in progress at the moment, but really interesting to think what they were doing up here in that early medieval period. The other thing we looked at was the gullies that had been come up in the geophysical survey. And what we realised is that we didn't just have one phase of activity going on, we had a whole series of phases of activity. So multiple gullies that were sort of cutting and intercutting each other. The earliest phase was very shallow. It could even have been that they were parts of structure that they represented the sort of footings of structures. We're not sure yet. But we had these 2 large curving ditches that I've outlined in yellow here. One is a penannular ditch, and one, we've only got part of it, but again, you can see that the post hole cuts through that. So the post over later building cuts through that as well. So these are all something it's actually much earlier and completely filled up by the time our post-built structure has been put in. And out of these, again, we got lots of wattle and daub material. We got very little in the way of pottery, but lots of wattle and daub, suggesting that they were open when this wattle and daub building burnt down. And actually, closer you get to the building, the more wattle and daub material you're getting. So clearly it's being filled up by material from that structure. The kind of penannular ditch or gully that you can see here as well The most prolific finds we got were sort of hornstones or whetstones. So we have got 8 have come out of that penannular ditch, suggesting that we've got sort of craft activity going on in that area. So we're not exactly sure what the nature of that is. We also discovered that the penannular ditch had been repaired on several occasions. So on that bottom left-hand side, you can see these 2 gullies side by side, and we could see the sections of the penannular gully had been repaired. So not all of it wasn't all just completely replaced, but there's sectional repairing going on. So you're getting a little bit of longevity in the life of that feature. And the last thing that we got was the kind of phase 3 gullies that kind of cut through that, indicating that they'd all been filled up by the time those phase 3 gullies were cut. But as I say, this is all still work in progress, all the post-excavations being done at the moment for this. The other interesting thing that we found in these gullies was a possible oven base. It wasn't in situ, but it seems to have been dumped in one of these gullies, indicating possibly that we have got occupation activity going on here in the earliest phases. The other target, we actually fully expected to find another burnt wattle and daub structure from another target on the geophysical survey, but archaeology never does what you want it to do. It always throws up something unexpected. And when we cleared off this area, all we could see was that pile of stones that you can see in the top left-hand corner of the slide. And we started excavating that stones, thinking we had a pit that was full of stone. And it's only when we were excavating the stones we realised that we could not find the edge of this pit. So we stopped and then reevaluated what we were doing and approached it in a slightly different manner, and actually realised that what we had was a big sort of sub-rectangular cut feature that's about 1/2 metre deep, and it's about 4.5 meters long and 3.5 meters wide. And although we've not fully excavated it yet, we're going to go back and excavate it next year fully. What we think we might have is sunken featured building. We might have stumbled across a sunken featured building, which again you would expect from sort of 5th to 7th centuries. So we're getting more evidence of early medieval activity going on there. As I said, relatively few small finds coming up, but what we do indicate is the multiple phases of activity on that site. So we've got a coin of Edward I, the long cross penny that came up from the topsoil, metal detecting, which is 13th century. We've got a piece of broken buckle, which we think is 11th century. We've got a spindle whorl. We've got some evidence for cloth making, and we think that's 9th or 10th century. And then we've got our hornstones, which again are probably a similar sort of date. So although we've got 5th, 6th century activity, and then we seem to jump possibly to sort of late Saxon post-conquest activity, we do seem to have phases of activity going on in between as well. So a real multi-page site, I think, which just makes it more interesting but more confusing for us as well. Right, I just want to sort of conclude then by saying that it's what a fascinating landscape there is at Skipsea. We've got middle to late Iron Age activity at Sparrow Croft, and late Iron Age activity as well, which works well with the dates that we've got from Castle Mound. That then we seem to have a phase of early medieval activity, which is quite substantial, and I think must have been buried, and is, although it's now only a sort of foot below the topsoil, just basically below the topsoil, I think it must have been much more deeply buried than that originally, and it's the modern agriculture that's actually starting to reveal it. And I think we are very lucky to catch it. In a few years' time, I think it would have been ploughed away. So we've been very lucky to catch that, really. So we have these at least two structures that we think might be 5th to 7th century in date. And associated with that, we seem to have craft working activities, possibly metalworking, possibly textile manufacture. I think there's more work we need to do on that side of it. And then what we've got is a much later post-built structure, which I'm still confident actually is either just pre or is related to the castle. And certainly what we have is an enclosure that's being occupied at the time that the castle was being occupied. So I think our idea that we've got an earlier bailey for the castle, I think is I think that idea still hangs true. And I think what it does is serve to sort of highlight some of these what we think are well-known sites actually have an awful lot more going on than we realise. It's only when you start to look that you can find completely new elements of it. And that's what I love about archaeology. You're never quite sure what you're going to find. Thank you very much.